Welcome, everyone. So my name's Dave Sedia. I'm an author, blogger, Egghead instructor, and I help Jeff organize this meetup. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about hooks. So 26 days ago at ReactConf in Las Vegas, Sophie Alpert and Dan Abramov announced a new feature proposal for React called Hooks. I wasn't there, but I watched the live stream, and it was exciting. And I also watched Twitter. And it was interesting because within the first couple hours, Twitter had Hooks Mania. It was crazy. And I think I saw maybe 3 implementations of Redux in the first 2 hours or something. Everyone was declaring Redux is dead. It seems to be a thing with React. So I had kind of a crazy thought. I was like, well, it's Thursday. I could maybe learn hooks this weekend and publish a new article every day next week on a hook. So I did that. I called it Hooks Week. I wrote 5 articles in 5 days, and I don't think I've written that much in a single week since college. By the end of it, I was feeling a little bit like this guy. But I learned a lot. This was me writing an infinite loop that hit Reddit over and over again. That was kind of a low point, but whatever. Live and learn. So I learned a bunch about hooks, and so here I'll give you kind of a guided tour of the basics of hooks, kind of what hooks are, how they work, and how you can start playing with them yourself. So before I go any further, I have a couple of questions. So who's heard of hooks already? Who's heard of hooks before tonight? Yeah, okay. Who's already played around with them? Okay. And maybe I shouldn't ask this. Who has deployed them to production? Nobody? Nice. That's the right number of hands. I had this slide as a backup in case. Yes, hooks. So hooks are a proposal. They're in alpha right now. They might still change. And so, don't put them in production yet. It's not a great idea. I think Facebook has been using them in production. I think they were using it for a month before release. So it probably wouldn't burn your app to the ground, but still not advisable. Everything in hooks is additive to React. So this is not replacing classes. They let you do more with functional components, but it's all new stuff. So if you don't want to use them, you don't have to. You can keep using classes if you like. There is an open RFC, so you can go check out this request for comments. Go to that GitHub link or the official docs. It's kind of plastered all over the official docs. And you can leave your suggestions and comments there. So let's look at a motivating example. If you have an app like this, where it's just a simple function component that's rendering some text, and you want to change it to display some number and maybe have a button that increments the number, you would normally have to write a class. This is normal. We're probably used to this if we're using React. So let's do that. We'll write class app extends React component. Turn this function into the render method. Don't forget the closing brace. Tab it all back in. Then you can declare the state. So we'll declare the state to initialize people to 0, and then down below we can render out people and set up an onClick handler. Inside here, we'll just call this.setState and base it off the existing state and set people to people plus 1. And so this is the normal way of adding state to a React component. And this works fine. We've been doing it for a while. But it's kind of a hassle, right? If you've been using React for a while, you've probably had this situation where you wrote a function component and it started off nice and simple, and then you had to add state or a life cycle or something, and you're like, I don't really wanna. I don't wanna. And you're like, maybe I can pull the state up to the parent component. They can pass it down. You're like, nah, it doesn't work. So you end up writing a class. So hooks kind of fixes this. So let's see how we write this component with hooks. Back to the first one, we'll import the useState hook from React. This is in React 16.7 alpha. And at the top of the function, we'll call useState, and initialize it by passing in 0. So remember, we initialize people to 0. This is a single piece of state, holds a single value, and we're passing in the initialization when we call it. It returns an array of 2 values. So we're going to destructure that array into people and set people. So every piece of state comes with its own setter function. And then down below, we can just render out people, because it's a variable that we have in scope. And for the onClick handler, we can call set people and pass in people plus 1. So this is like the Hooksy way to add state to a function component. And it's nicer, right? The code's a lot simpler, and you didn't have to do all that reorganization stuff. But if this is like kind of your first time seeing this, if you haven't played with hooks yet, you might be wondering, like, how does that actually work? Like, what? There's a function, and the first line is like a stateful thing, but the function is stateless. How does this work? So I'll get to that in a second. First, I want to talk about this destructuring syntax. If you're used to destructuring, this is probably like old hat to you, but if you're not, I think it kind of throws some people for a loop in the beginning. So this useState thing returns an array, and we can destructure that array. So what this is really just doing is pulling out the first and second value. So this is equivalent to saving the return value into some other variable, and then pulling out people, hook state 0 and hook state 1, and putting them into variables. So if you're used to, you're probably used to like object destructuring if you've used React a bit, but array destructuring isn't used quite as often. So anyway, 30 seconds on array destructuring. So now let's talk about how this actually works in React. Like how is it maintaining state in a seemingly stateless function? So React, for every function component, it creates kind of this like backing metadata object. And in that object is this list of hooks. It starts off empty, and the index pointer points to the first cell in this array. And so when it's executing the component, it creates this thing the first time. And then when you call one of these hooks, like useState, it occupies one of those slots, and it puts the initialized value in there, and then continues on rendering. And it moves the index down to the next level. So if there was another hook, that would take up the second slot. But there's no more hooks here, right? There's just one useState. So now we can call the button. Say we click the button, and it calls this thing here. And set people changes the 0 to a 1. And then React re-renders, because this is how state works, right? You change the state, React re-renders the component. So back to the top. But also notice the pointer resets to the top. So you've got this persistent array, persistent list of hooks. I think it's actually a linked list under the hood that holds these values. And so now when it runs through the function, I should say when the function runs, React isn't like running your function line by line or anything. When your function runs and you call useState, it knows, it can look at this array and say, oh, okay, I have something in slot 0. So I will just use that. So just to kind of hammer this home, we'll look at an example with 2 variables. I've got 2 pieces of state here. And when you click the numbers, the pieces of state change independently. And I've named them like set grams coffee and set ounces water, just to prove that you don't have to call it like value and set value. It's not like a hard-coded thing. It's kind of a convention, I guess, but you can call the things whatever you want. So how is this working? So let's go through the same example here. So React creates this empty list. It calls your component. The useState 13 takes up the first slot, and the index moves down. useState 8 takes up the second slot, and the index moves down. And then the render's done. So then say you click the set grams coffee button, and it goes back to the top, and now coffee's 14. And on the second time through, it already has these 2 things in place. So it can recall the old state. So I think now we could talk about the rules of hooks. There aren't too many of them. First one is that the call order has to be stable. Because of this list thing, right, where it's kind of keeping track of what's called when, you have to call them in the same order every time. It's not that the hooks have to be called in a certain order, it's just that you can't change it between renders. And this isn't usually a problem, right? Like code doesn't usually like reorganize itself during runtime. But if you're calling hooks from loops or conditionals, if switches, whatever, or nested functions like an event handler or something, that would violate this rule. So avoid that. Second rule is to only call hooks from function components or custom hooks. We'll see custom hooks later. We can't call hooks from classes. So yeah, functions only. Sorry, classes. Third one is that names should start with use. We've seen use state. We'll see a few more. This is really like a linting rule thing because React, I think Create React App is going to come with linting rule if it doesn't already, but it'll check to make sure that you're not using a hook inside a loop or conditional or function or whatever. But it can only figure that out if you prefix the names with use. So do that. So now let's look at another hook. This one's called useReducer. And we're going to build a little example here that just has a room with a light switch. So we'll destructure this useReducer call. So useReducer is similar to useState. It returns an array of two things. The first one's the value. We're going to have light. It's going to be a Boolean. And the second one is the dispatch function. So this is sort of your setter. And useReducer takes two arguments. The first one is a reducer function, which the function takes the state and the action that was dispatched and returns a new state. And the second argument is the initial value, kind of like we already saw with useState. And we can fill in this reducer. So we'll just switch on the action. And if we passed in the string on, then we'll return true. And if it was off, we'll return false. Now I'm just going to paste in some code here. And so this just toggles a class to lit or unlit based on whether this thing's true or false. And when you click the button, it will dispatch an action that will sort of go through this reducer and then return a new state, and the component will re-render. So useReducer is good for handling more complex state in your components. If you've got like a bunch of different values, or if you've got something that's kind of more like a state machine, maybe like a traffic light or something where it kind of goes through step by step, A, B, C, and then back to A or something. useReducer would probably be a good set for that. You might think about, your mind might jump to Redux when you hear the word reducer. And so useReducer, it works similar to a Redux reducer, but it's scoped to a single component. This is not like global state like Redux is. We can sort of fake that if we combine useReducer with useContext, and that's what all those people on Twitter did. You can write your own Redux with hooks pretty quickly, but it's still, you're still writing your own Redux. So let's look at another hook, useContext. And for this one, how many people have used the context API? Not that many. How many people have heard of the context API? More? Okay, cool. So I'll do a quick demo of what context is and what problem it solves first, and then I'll talk about how useContext helps, makes it better. Yeah. So context solves this problem where you have, say this component or this app here has there's like a header and there's a body, and the body has sidebar and content. And you've got to pass this user down through the tree. And this isn't a super extreme example, but you can see there's the body component that's receiving a user prop, and then it passes it along to the sidebar. And like the body doesn't care about the user, it just needs to take it and pass it along. So if you were to change that prop, or add a new prop or something, you've got to kind of touch all these points and update them, and it's kind of a pain. So a lot of times people reach for Redux for this, right? The Redux connect function lets you plug data into any component. So context lets you do the same thing. So what we can do is we can create a context. This API has been in React since 16.3, maybe 16.4, something like that. It's been there for a little while. So you call create context, and it returns a user context object, or returns a context object. This object has two properties. There's a producer, a provider, and a consumer. So we can wrap the root of our app here with the provider, and really? Oh, you can't see this. Adobe update, it's trying to update Flash Player. All right. Love it. So let me just, okay, where are we here? Go back. All right, I'm just going to skip forward a little bit here. So, so we can wrap the root of our app with this provider thing. Create context. Yep. Come on, provider. All right. And what this will let us pass values throughout the app. And this provider takes a value prop. We can pass in a single thing. If you want to pass more than one thing, you can pass an object with a bunch of stuff in it. But so we're going to pass this user. And what provider will do is pass that down throughout the tree. It's kind of like a conduit that connects to everything underneath here. So header and body can access this thing, and also sidebar. So we can go down to sidebar, and we can wrap it in a user context consumer, which is the other part of that context object. And then we get this error here because the consumer uses the render props pattern. It expects its child to be a function. It wants a single child and that child should be a function. So if you pass it in regular JSX, you'll get this weird render is not a function error. So we wrap this thing with a function. Then the app is back to working. And this function receives the value that we passed into the provider, comes out in the consumer. And we can call it whatever we want. We'll call it user, but you can call it anything. And now that we have this value from coming from context, we don't need it from the prop anymore. So we can delete it from sidebar, we can delete it from here, we can delete it from the body, and we don't have to pass it into body anymore. So this is pretty cool, right? Like if all you're using Redux for is to pass data deeply, maybe context is all you really need. Maybe this will be good for you. But so there's still sort of this kind of downside with this, in that there's next video. There's this nesting here. So it's these components don't render. Like the consumer doesn't render out. It just kind of renders whatever's inside it. But your code gets more complex. And if you have multiple contexts, say you're consuming like maybe current user and language and theme or something, right? You'll have like this 3 levels deep nesting. And it gets kind of unwieldy. So the use context hook can help with this. So what we can do is import use context. And then down in this sidebar where we're using a consumer, we can just call use context and pass in the full context object, not just the consumer, whole thing. And it returns the user. And now that we have this user from coming from the hook, we don't need to wrap it with that consumer anymore. So it cleans up the code quite a bit. I think if anyone saw the Ryan Florence's talk during Hook's announcement day, he had a good example of this where he had like multiple levels of nesting and it just all collapsed, and it was great. Not as this one's not as impressive, but still cool. So let's talk about the useEffect hook. Another one. I think we're on 4 now, right? useEffect is kind of like a combination of component did mount and component did update and component will unmount. It's like 3 life cycles in one. So this lets you add lifecycle methods to your function components. But it's a little weird to use. So let's look at this example here. We'll pull in useState and useEffect. And borrowing from Dan Abramov's idea, I'm just going to change the document title here. So create a piece of state to hold the title, which is currently hooks. And we'll render out an input that just renders, it's going to use this value, and when you change the value, it'll update the title. Sort of standard controlled input kind of thing, right? And we can call useEffect. And what this will do, and inside here we'll set the document title equal to the this title from the input. So what this will do is run, this effect will run after every render. So the first one and every subsequent render. So it's kind of like, think of it as component did mount and component did update. So here you can see like there's one render, it says set title hooks. And then if I type in the box, every change causes a re-render and causes the title to be reset. And we can look at another example of effects. So where you would normally fetch data in component did mount, right? So like if your component needs we're going to get some posts from Reddit. We'll see if we can do it not too badly. So we'll initialize an array of posts to empty. So useState can hold a single value, but it can be any sort of value. It doesn't have to be a number. It can be an array. It can be a whole object. So here, this one's going to hold an array. And we're just going to kind of map over the posts and render out list items. And then we'll write a useEffect function that's going to fetch from the React.js subreddit. And then parse the JSON, and then take the JSON and pull out all the posts. And then we will take the posts and set the state. Now I'm just going to open up the network tab. Keep an eye on this. Because when I save, it's calling Reddit over and over and over again. So the fix for this is to pass a second argument to useEffect. So normally useEffect will run after every render, right? So it does the fetch, and then whenever it finishes, it sets the posts, which changes the state, which re-renders, right? And then it fetches again, and sets the posts and re-renders, over and over forever. So the fix for this is to pass a second argument to useEffect. The second argument is an array of dependencies. Think of them as dependencies. And this array is sort of like saying, whenever one of these things changes, you should rerun the effect. And if you pass an empty array, it's like saying, only ever run this thing once. So on mount, it will, the initial render, it will run the effect, fetch the posts, set the data, and then the next time it won't run the effect. So it's kind of a gotcha with useEffect. This array argument is kind of a sort of weird. I think something to watch out for if you're playing around with it. Maybe keep an eye on your network tab. So let's go back to the first example where we're setting the document title. And this time I'm just going to duplicate this input and we'll hold a number. And so here we've got 2 inputs and 2 pieces of state. And only one useEffect, right? So you'd think that when you change the title, it will update the title, which is what it should do. But also, if you change the number, it will trigger a re-render and update the title. And this is because the useEffect doesn't have the second argument, right? We only have the one passing the function, but no dependencies array. So what we should be passing here is an array including title. because this effect function depends on title. So sort of you can think of, if you're wondering like what to put in this array, you can read through your function, the useEffect function, and anything that is, if it's referencing a variable that's in scope, so like title here, any of those things should go in the array. Just kind of mechanically put those in the array and you should be okay. I think I forgot to mention earlier that the setter functions for when you call useState and the dispatch function when you call useReducer, they're only generated once. So you'll always get the same function, which is nice for this. So if you put that function in your array of dependencies, it won't re-render all the time. That function will only change once. So if we put title there, then we can go up to here, and when we change the title, it changes the title. And when we change the number, it leaves the title alone. So let's look at more example of useEffect. And here we've got this app that it's using a component called test right now that doesn't exist. We're going to write that in a second. So what this app will do is it's got one piece of state called mounted. And when you click a button, it will toggle whether the test component is mounted or not, which is what that mounted and test line is doing. If mounted is false, test doesn't render at all. And then when mounted becomes true, test renders and it mounts. So it's actually unmounting and remounting every time you click the button. So we'll make a test component that just says I am mounted. And inside the test, we'll call useEffect. And just log out when it gets unmounted. So this is how, remember I said that useEffect is kind of 3 life cycles in one, and component will unmount is one of them. If you return a function from useEffect, you get effectively component will unmount. Sort of. It will unmount before it runs. It'll unmount before the component unmount, or it'll run this function before it runs for the unmounts the component. But it'll also run this returned value. It'll run this cleanup function before it runs the effect again. So if your effect can run multiple times, like say it might subscribe to an event listener or something, maybe you add event listener in the effect and then remove event listener in your cleanup. That would be kind of a valid use case, but every time it ran, it would add a new one and remove the old one. So we're also we'll write a useEffect to run when it mounts. So here we're passing the empty array as the second arg. So the first one will run on mount, and the second one will only run on unmount. And if we open up the console, we can see it mounted, and then it'll unmount, and it works. So looking at these functions it's sort of, they're kind of opaque. Like if you don't really know how useEffect works yet, especially if this is like the first time you're seeing it, this is like there's just a lot of braces and parentheses and what's really happening there. So we could give these things more useful names if we write custom hooks. So a custom hook is really just a function that calls hooks. So we'll name it with use. We'll call it use on unmount. And we'll call useEffect in here. And so this custom hook function will take a function and then make an effect that returns that function and only runs once. So basically doing the same, like a genericized version of what we have up here. So now we can call use on unmount and just pass in a function that we want to run when the component unmounts. And we can go back and do the same thing with nope. Okay. Fast forward button. It's not very fast though. So we can, right, so we've got custom hooks that will run on unmount, and then we can write another one that will run when the component mounts. So we'll write one called useOnMount, and it will call useEffect, and in here we'll call that function. And then we can replace this one with useOnMount, and it all still works. So this is sort of it's a very light version of custom hooks, but the idea is powerful. I think the ability to take sort of like bundles of state or bundles of imperative logic and bundle them up into custom hooks that you can reuse, I think is going to be pretty awesome. So there are a bunch of other hooks that I didn't have time to cover tonight. There's one for memoizing expensive computations. There's one for memoizing callbacks. You can use refs in function components now. So if you have like an input and you want to get a ref to it or something, you can call useRef for that. And then there's these other ones that are, the bottom two are kind of like useEffect, but they run at different times. And useImperative methods sort of lets you return like a public API from your component. So how can you, if you want to play around with these right now, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can, in an existing project, you can update React to 16.7 alpha. It's at alpha 2 right now. I don't know how long it'll be 2, but maybe. I think if you just ask for 16.7 alpha, Yarn or NPM will yell at you and be like, did you mean 2 or 1 or 0? So just 16.7 alpha will work. Or you can use Code Sandbox. You can go to this link if you really want to. This just has these dependencies set up for you. But it's easy enough in Code Sandbox to change, just to go into the sidebar and change the React and React DOM versions to be 16.7 alpha. Make sure you change both React and React DOM. If you change only one, like I just changed React, and then you get a bunch of weird errors. Yeah, change both. So yeah, so here's a couple places you can go to learn more. The official docs are really good for hooks. They've got an FAQ, they've got like an API reference, kind of like a lot of the motivations behind them and everything. Just reactjs.org/hooks. You can go to my site, davesadia.com/hooks will bring you to all the posts that I wrote a couple weeks back. This guy named Nick Graff has a cool collection of React hooks. It's like a searchable list of a bunch of custom hooks that people have created. And a lot of them are pretty simple. I think you can learn a lot by just going in and reading some of the source code. And I think a lot of the things like tracking scroll position or something like that, like a lot of things are pretty simple to implement yourself once you understand how they work. So that's fun. Go through there. And then there's usehooks.com, which is like a new hook every day. He's been keeping up with it. He had one today, so hopefully he'll keep going with that. That's all I got. Thanks.